Thank you very much, Alex. It's a real privilege to be here. I was telling people earlier during the social that we've been here, I think over 10 years, almost 12 years actually, as parishioners, and I've spoken all over the world, but I haven't spoken in my own parish yet. So it's really great to be with you tonight. I'll begin by speaking about our own time, and then I'm going to speak about ancient times. And then I'm going to come back and speak about our own time again. It's no secret that we live in a secularizing age, an age which is materialist and skeptical about God. That's not to say that our age is not religious. Our age is religious even when it's secular. We often see politics and even political ideologies that are opposed to Christian thought, which can take on a pseudo-religious fervor. Think of how the idol of choice is held up as a rationale for the sacrifice of the unborn, or think about how fervently religious is the insistence that gender is something chosen rather than given by God. Or think of how certain progressive views of science become a kind of bludgeon against religion, turning science into something which disproves God because God is not empirically verifiable. These are all evidence of how very religious our secular age is. So much so that my friend Robert George, professor of law at Princeton, has called our age an age of the new pagans. Tonight I want to talk about not the new pagans, though, but the old pagans, by which I mean not only the world that once believed in many gods, but the world that used reason to arrive at belief in one God. I'm going to do this largely by way of Saint Augustine, who is a 5th century bishop from North Africa, whose masterwork, The City of God Against the Pagans, includes a fascinating engagement not only with the errors of pagan polytheism, but also the promise of pagan reason to arrive at knowledge of God. St. Augustine looks at ancient philosophy. It was even ancient for him, who's already ancient for us. He looks back to the pre-Socratics, and then to Socrates, and then to Plato, and then to the skeptics. And so tonight I want to walk through his treatment of the pre-Socratic materialists, what I call the Platonic realists, and then after that, the decline of philosophical reason into skepticism, and then speak about how Augustine and we can engage in pagan reason, in conversations with pagan reason. St. Augustine considers pre-Socratic materialism at some length, before turning to the realism of Socrates and Plato. Those were the philosophers who arrived at certain knowledge of God's existence by way of rational demonstration. As we shall see, he saw materialism rightly walking towards questions of causation. Why do we have something rather than nothing? But because they were blind to anything outside of an immanent order of causes, Augustine thought that the materialists tended towards pantheism, gods in all things, rather than a rational belief in a transcendent God. I think this is instructive also for materialists today, so I'll treat this first. Second, Augustine sees Plato's First Academy as a permanent philosophical advance. It's here, following Socrates' arguments concerning the final end, that Plato arrives at rational demonstrations for God's existence. While he has certain Christian criticisms of Plato, Augustine highlights how the greatest Hellenistic philosopher walked towards Christianity well before the advent of Christ. And so he sees him as a providential witness to the reasonableness of believing in the one true God as the uncaused cause, the supreme being above all things. Finally, Augustine sees that this great philosophical achievement of reason turned out also to be fragile. He thinks it is rational to believe in God. He believes in the permanent philosophical advance of Plato, but he also thinks there is a weakness of human reason, evident in the philosophical decline of the Second and Third Academy, which lent itself to skepticism, the inability to know anything at all. By the end, I hope to bring us back to some concluding reflections on our own time as we seek to engage our materialist and skeptical neighbors. First, ancient materialism. The ancient pre-Socratic materialists theorized that all the different kinds of things that make up the world were reducible to one elemental thing. Think of the element of fire or the element of water or air. This turns out to be something similar to thinking that the world is reducible to what would our materialists say today? Atomic principles, atomic molecules, chemical elements, right? Our materialists today would also want to reduce the world into some elements of existence. The trouble is that this just doesn't explain what things are. And it doesn't really tell us why the world exists at all. Some late pre-Socratics considered that divine intelligence resided in the particles of the material universe, a view well on its way to pantheism, Augustine thought. Give materialism a long enough philosophical run, and it will become bad religion. Our world also views creation in these reducible terms. We tend to view the world as something reducible to elements. We tend to miss the larger explanations for how all the parts fit together. It's not uncommon for a person today to sit with two contradictory views. On the one hand, they will regard the material world to be of infinite value, sometimes even more valuable than human life itself. And at the same time, they'll think that it's scientific to view the created world as the result of haphazard chance, without any intelligent directive agent, which we could call God. How do these two things line up? How can a person think both that the world is of infinite value, that the world is of great value, and that there's nothing which causes it? In some ways, we've returned today to a pre-Socratic account of being. Before Socrates, most Hellenistic philosophers were materialists, much more sophisticated materialists, but nevertheless precursors to the idea that everything that exists is essentially material. Like modern materialists, ancient materialists thought that we should be pursuing the cause of everything. They didn't posit a Big Bang, but they did arrive at something like a causal explanation for why anything exists in time. The pre-Socratics observed that there were many kinds of things in the world, all composed of parts. But searching for that elemental thing, as we said, fire, water, air, turns out to be something very much like arriving at the appearance of things, but not the things themselves. The pre-Socratics fail to arrive at what things are and where they come from. The scientific materialism of our age is unlike ancient scientific materialism because the ancients didn't exclude knowledge of God's existence, whereas ours do. It's Pierre-Simon Laplace who says that modern science has no need of that hypothesis called God. The modern materialist comes to a certain understanding of the material world without ever even considering causation, metaphysical causation at all. They look for larger explanations for how the material parts fit together. The way they see how all the parts fit together, however, do not explain the whole. Those who take the view that everything that exists is the result of chance are unwittingly committing themselves to the view that nature is ours for the taking, that nature doesn't have a law which can be properly observed, but is itself lawless, has arisen out of chance, error, conflict, force, energy, not susceptible to God's commands, but only to ours. On this side of the ledger, the materialist sees nature as not so much materially reducible to one thing as something which is always in our command, something which is both a kind of creation myth and something that we create. So today we find ourselves in the midst of a great focus of energy on nature, which lacks an account of what nature is, what the created world is. We lack today, in a materialist scientific worldview, an account of a provident cause for everything that exists. The solution to this was ancient realism. It's not accidental that the pre-Socratic materialists finally gave way to the likes of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These thinkers made a cosmic metaphysical leap in thinking about causality differently. They no longer searched for some elemental cause in the material universe, but desired to know the transcendent, uncaused cause of all things, which they sometimes called the supreme being, or the final end of all things. Their philosophical innovation was to see that the material world has a cause outside of itself, which must be intelligent. They transcended the materialist order of causes. The pre-Socratics sometimes considered, as I said, the divine intelligence in the particles of the universe. But the transcendental realists of the First Academy made a much greater monumental leap in philosophy by seeing that the cause of all things was itself outside and above all things, as uncaused, outside the order of causes completely. They arrived at a better answer to the pre-Socratic question of why there is something rather than nothing. Socrates saw, Augustine writes, that man had been trying to discover the causes of the universe. Socrates looks back at the prior philosophical history and he sees a kind of philosophical search for the causes of the universe. But he lacks something, Socrates believes. He believes that the universe should have a first supreme cause in nothing but the will of the supreme God. And he thinks that the pre-Socratics did not arrive at this because they lacked a purified intelligence, he writes, one free from earthly passions. So this is the first time in history where a philosopher says you actually have to purify your life in order to see the highest truths. So he thinks actually the pre-Socratics could not actually arrive at anything beyond this world because their passions were too attached to this world. And so Socrates demanded that the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, must live a new disciplined kind of life. There's a wonderful book by Pierre Hadot called Philosophy as a Way of Life, and it's all about how Socrates revolutionized thinking about philosophy as a way of life in which you lived a moral life. Socrates thought it essential to move beyond materialism. One needed to insist on the need to cleanse one's life by accepting a high moral standard so that the soul should be relieved of the weight of lust that held it down. This is a quote. And then by its natural vigor could rise up to the sphere of the eternal and behold, thanks to a pure intelligence, the essence of the immaterial and unchangeable light where dwell the causes of all things in undisturbed stability. This is a magnificent leap in philosophical thinking. Socrates' great advance was to see that we had to purify our lives in order to see the highest good. Socrates' advance gave rise to the problem of the highest good as the necessary condition for human happiness. In order to truly be happy, he believed that the mind needed to see the cause of all things. This, most importantly, gave rise to another student of his named Plato. And Augustine says it's Plato who perfects pagan philosophy. The pre-Socratics had asked how the things of this world could be reducible to one thing. But it's impossible to look at, say, a cabbage, squirrel monkeys, gray whales, sand, orchids, and claim that all of these are reducible to the same thing. We can't do that. So Plato gave a better answer to the pre-Socratic question. Namely, that all of these things, cabbage, squirrel monkeys, gray whales, sand, orchids, all these things have unique natures which are not reducible to any element. They're not reducible at all, except in one way. They all exist. The cabbage, the gray whales, the sand, the orchids, they all share this thing in common. They exist. They share existence. That's the elemental thing that they all share. The great advance was to see that the common thing wasn't something material or elemental. What all of these things shared was existence. It's from this insight that Platonists reasoned that since all things share existence in common, then the supreme cause of all these things must be existence itself. In this way, they arrive at the classical metaphysical distinction that while the nature of all things have a share in existence, God's nature is existence itself. As Augustine writes of the Platonic realists, quote, "They saw that in every mutable being, the form which determines its being, its mode of being, and its nature can only come from he who truly is, because he exists immutably, unchangeably. The material world has existence. It's constantly moving and changing in and out of existence. It has a share of it, but is not itself it. For the Supreme Being, however, existence is not something different from life. For God to exist is the same to live, to understand, to be happy. And so the Platonists came to see, Augustine argued, that there must be some being in which the original form of all created things reside in an unchangeable way, and therefore an incomparable way. And they rightly believed that it is there that the origin of all things is to be found, in the uncreated, which is the source of all creation, namely God. This is the great achievement of the Platonic realists, according to Augustine. They arrived at the uncaused cause of everything raised high beyond all things. This we can call God. Now, Augustine is quite clear. The Platonists can't enjoy this God. They can't know him and be happy in God's nature forever without the right kind of attachment to him, which comes to us only through Jesus Christ. But Augustine's convinced that they have come to something like the grandeur of reason in arriving at certain true metaphysical knowledge that God exists, and it is rational to believe so. In The City of God, he also says, however, that Platonic reason also fails in certain respects. It arrives at this great height, but it also fails in other respects. How does it fail? Well, for one thing, this perfect pagan philosophy fails to crush the errors of pagan polytheism, fails to crush all the false gods. And he speculates as to why that is. He concludes that reason could crush many, many errors, but it couldn't crush every error. Only divine revelation can crush every error. Think of Mary crushing the head of the serpent. This is also to be reminded not only of the grandeur of reason, but also of its weaknesses, of its limits, which he seems to suggest follows even in the second and third academy of Athens. The schools which followed Plato's school were skeptical. How could we go from such a great height of reason and what reason is capable of, knowledge of the highest good of God himself, to the nadir of wondering if we can know anything at all? So thirdly, ancient skepticism. Beginning with the Socratic insight that in order to see the final end, we must purify our lives through a philosophical form of life, we arrived at the greatest intellectual achievements in Athens. Yet the Athenian academy ended skeptically, with dogged disputes in which men eschewed truth to partake of probabilities. About these late academic skeptics, Saint Augustine asks, why do they live a life of disputation at all? Why enter into dogged disputes if the end result is mere probabilities rather than, say, truth and wisdom leading to happiness? He concluded that the skeptics were actually so prideful about never falling into error that they end up betraying truth itself and did not become wise. We are capable of truth, yet as our intellect reaches out to know, it will inevitably come to know truths mixed with much error. We don't need an account of sin to recognize that smart people are often wrong, sometimes through ignorance and sometimes through immoralities that need to be purified as clouds which prevent the intellect from seeing truth. The Socratic problem was that we actually need to purify our lives, but this tradition fell on hard times in the Third Academy. Augustine says they loved truth. For this we know, they loved truth so much that they actually fell into a great fear of error that consequently harmed their willingness to assent to any truth. Skeptics feared falling into error most of all. Since the wise man was never in error, they said, they should not hold anything to be true, only probable. You could know things to be truthy, but never true. Augustine puzzled over how skeptics could spend so much time in philosophical dispute if they just thought things were truthy and not true. If they could never assent to truth and only probability, what were they looking for? Philosophers were supposed to be lovers of wisdom, Augustine said. But he asked, how can you become wise if you think wisdom can never be found? And that is something which afflicts us today. Augustine refutes the skeptical life on intellectual grounds first, by turning to rhetoric and dialectic, especially the law of non-contradiction, to affirm that if basic truths can be adequately demonstrated, for example, that something can't be and not be at the same time, one can't have the lights on and off at the same time in the same way, for example, then it follows that greater truths can be known up a scale. Truths which are material and changeable could actually lead us to truths which are immaterial and unchangeable. In this way, we can follow a process of dialectic, Augustine thought, and arriving at the knowledge of the essence of things. First, through our senses, we simply look out at the world with our sensorium, with our eyes, with our ears. With all of our senses, we can look out and apprehend the world. And through apprehension, we can make judgments. It's light enough in here. And through these judgments, we can begin to reason about these judgments in a process of dialectic. This is how we can proceed humbly to arrive at real knowledge of reality. Not without any errors, but through a process of dialectic, we can purify the mind and help the mind to conform to the reality of what things are, the essence of things. This includes, as I say, some epistemic humility, but also a realistic confidence that we can really know things, rather than to constantly be left in a world of probabilities, of mere truthiness, or fundamentally doubt and fear that we should never assent to anything at all. It seems to me that. He also refutes the skeptical life on moral grounds, arguing that it leads not only to an unhappy life, but an absurd one. He tells the story of two travelers, each one journeying to the same destination. A sophisticated skeptic, a Third Academy skeptic perhaps, and a simple country person. They're traveling, and each is lost. Each is passing through a town, and each asks directions to their destination. The country person asks a local shepherd if he knows how to find his destination, and he's promptly given directions on how to get there. The skeptical man asks several townspeople. Each of them sound truthy enough, but not truthy enough. The skeptical man begins to poll people to see who has the best directions to his endpoint, and none of them quite add up until he finds a finely dressed man astride a horse, and this impresses him. The man on the horse gives him wonderful directions, which sound most truthy. Unfortunately, the finely dressed man on the horse was a trickster, and he had deceived the skeptic, who never arrived at his destination as a result. In fact, the story is intentionally absurd to show that a skeptic would not actually behave this way in real life. The skeptic actually would not live this way. Right? To show the skeptic that this is an absurd way to live. In this way, the story illustrates something we often observe today. That in real life, we rarely dispute with people in the way that we might do online or in print. Augustine refutes the skeptic because the skeptic has no account of truth that could provide a basis for right action, as the story shows, nor an account of final truth that can bring the skeptic happiness. And lacking these, the skeptic has a massive epistemic barrier to being converted to truth itself. If you can't believe that there is any truth to be found, what will you do when truth itself comes knocking on your door? Think of Pontius Pilate, who asks, what is truth? When truth is right before him. Interestingly, Augustine's still kind of sympathetic to the skeptics. Why do they live this kind of absurd life of truthiness and probability, never committing to anything, like teenagers? Why do they do it? Why do they enter into dogged disputes that are endless if they think that the end result is mere probabilities and not truth, not wisdom, not happiness? Augustine gives a fascinating answer, and it's a good one for our teenagers. They protest too much, he says. They protest too much. He says they inherited the Platonic secret of truth, and they're zealous to guard it. But they have guarded truth in such a way as to have betrayed truth itself. They have put all these protections around the Platonic secret of what's true about unchangeable being, but then they've forgotten that end to which they were ordered. I think the same thing might be said today about our endless dogged, discordant disputes in public. All our polarized dogmatism today hides a kind of insecurity that we feel as a secular culture, that the truth is elusive, that it can only be secured by power. Because skepticism can lead people to believe that all they can really know is what they feel. And so the highest truth they can know is quite literally an emoticon, an emotion, a passion, a movement of soul that feels quite beyond their control, like brute facts. Immanuel Kant's rational and enlightened skepticism excluded reason's ability to demonstrate God's existence. But this didn't immediately lead to atheism. It led to Schleiermacher. It led to the idea that the highest truths were not a matter of reason, but a matter of feeling, emotion. As a result, our desire for the highest truths today become interiorized and emotivist. And as social creatures, we look for the tribe that sees the same truth and is willing to help us secure it by power, because we have given up on the power of reason. But this is a deep mistake for our polity and for our culture. The error of believing that truth can only be secured by power, my truth versus your truth, is actually a betrayal of our rational nature, a betrayal of our deepest desires as social and rational creatures who are made to know reality together, to see the same truth together. Overall, what Augustine sees in the history of ancient pagan thought is both a magnificent potential to arrive at the truth of God's existence, the summum bonum, the highest good, which alone can make us happy. St. Paul says in the letter to the Romans that no one has an excuse. God can be known from the things which have been made because we see the cause indirectly through the created effects. We can know God through the things which have been made, St. Paul teaches. The materialists' mistake is they want to see God directly in the things that have made, not through them. They looked at the material effects but could not see the immaterial cause, nor understand that it was outside of the order of causes. Good scientists today don't do that. They don't confuse science with metaphysics. But many materialists invoke science today as though it provides proof that God doesn't exist. This is actually an irrational claim itself, both in terms of misunderstanding what the scientific method is for and for understanding metaphysical causation, which can and does yield rational demonstrations of a first mover, an uncaused cause, the highest good, and so on. But we can say, as Catholics, to both materialists and skeptics, that reason is made to do more than that. Reason's not made for skepticism. Reason isn't just made to look at the surface of things, but to penetrate into the reality of things and to see what is the cause of all things, to see God. All right, take questions. I'll let you think about your questions and I'll say one more thing. Catholics have always held up the grandeur of reason. Even though we're called to announce the gospel, we hold up the grandeur of reason, and we always encourage philosophy. We always encourage the pursuit of knowledge precisely because we know the God who has spoken to us through Jesus Christ, the God who is the Logos, the reason of all reason. We know God in a much greater way than unaided reason ever could. We've been illumined in such a way as to know and love the Trinity. But this gives us confidence also to enter into real conversations with those who do not believe in God, either by reason or by faith. we can enter into reasonable discourse with materialists and skeptics about how we can know anything at all, or about how we can know the cause of things. Because, as I said, if you don't believe that someone can know the truth, or if you don't believe that we can't know the cause of all that exists, then we are less likely to receive Jesus Christ, who is both the truth and the cause of everything. All right, now you've had time to think about your question. Yes?
For about 800 years, our theology was Augustine and Plato. And then now we have Aquinas and Aristotle. How and why do you change?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is for 800 years we have Augustine and Plato, and then for another 800 years we have Aristotle and Aquinas. That is a sort of historical way of putting it, that the great contribution of St. Thomas Aquinas was to show how Aristotle was how Aristotle's reason was not contrary to the faith, but in fact aided the faith, aided our understanding of the faith. Plato and Augustine have the exact same relationship in a way, in that Augustine takes, as I said, Plato to be the most perfect pagan philosopher. Aquinas takes Aristotle to be the most perfect pagan philosopher. I think to say that those aren't sort of eras, though, because, say, for example, Aquinas sees himself as an Augustinian, right? So he sees himself as a Aristotelian Augustinian, right? So while you can sort of periodize this, Augustine and Plato's influence carries on. For example, in other 13th century thinkers like Bonaventure or Duns Scotus, who are going to still stay much more closely to Plato than to Aristotle. So you're right to say that in the 13th century, Aristotle takes on much greater importance to the teaching of Thomas Aquinas. But they're not exactly at odds with each other. But the basic principle is the same, which is that each of the philosophers are actually, they arrive at the cause of everything. And because both Plato and Aristotle arrive at the cause of everything, they're the kind of philosophers who exemplify what it looks like when reason's working well. And so those are the kind of philosophers that Catholics have always lifted up. We tend not to lift up Derrida. We tend not to lift up philosophers who don't arrive at the cause of everything in the same way, because they just don't have the same status for us. Plato and Aristotle exhibit a kind of preambula fidei. They're walking towards God, and this is something which both Augustine and Aquinas take up and embrace the unity between faith and reason. More time for thoughts. Yes. Yes, you.
I'm curious, is this focus on rationality somewhat of a red herring? I mean, I studied Aristotle and Aquinas. One of my favorites is actually Kierkegaard. He kind of, after analyzing it all, kind of chucked it out the window and said, really what this boils down to is you need to choose. And that notion of making faith a choice, as opposed to something you would naturally, rationally derive, because there's all sorts of people out there debating whether you can prove it, you can't prove it. Ultimately, don't you have to kind of walk that line and make a choice?
Yeah. So, Kierkegaard's leap of faith. What I want to say about that is that the leap of faith is, I think, best not thought of as part of fundamental theology. That fundamental theology is actually asking us to think about what it is that reason can know about God. When you're talking about a leap of faith, you're actually talking about something that gets a little bit more into the area of the act of faith. Catholics call the act of faith. And that's different than arriving at belief that either reason can arrive at demonstrations which you don't even need to call God, which are God, right? You don't have to say, you can say that there must be a first cause, and that first cause has to have a beginning that isn't caused, and you don't have to call that God, but you can say that this is necessary to explain why there's something rather than nothing. But what Kierkegaard is after is something much more in the sort of post-Kantian Protestant stream of thinking about how do we arrive at faith if it's no longer rational to demonstrate God's existence. And so Kierkegaard is arriving, well, if Kant's right that we can no longer demonstrate God's existence and we still want to believe in God, then we have to take a leap of faith. And so I think you're taking, you've got a hook in your mouth when you take in Kierkegaard, and the hook is that you've bought Kant's argument that we can no longer demonstrate God's existence by reason. And so you're taking, instead of Schleiermachian Gefühl and feeling, you're taking the will in Kierkegaard as the thing which is permitting you to have a rational belief. And I think it's a mistake. But Kierkegaard's good for all sorts of other things, I think. Kierkegaard's a kind of stimulus for thought. But I don't think he's good on fundamental theology. Yes, sir?
So about that reason, can you have these conversations with our unbelieving friends? What about our Lutheran friends?
What about our what?
What about our Lutheran friends?
Oh yeah. What about conversations? Yeah, that's a great question. I think in some ways it's more difficult to have that conversation with our Protestant brothers and sisters. They, especially if they're very committed to fideism. But the thing that I have found to be useful is to ask just simple questions about what they believe about Jesus Christ. So, for example, a Lutheran who actually wants to affirm the Chalcedon definition that Christ is two natures in one person, right? And ask, how do you know what a nature is? How do you know what a person is? Those are serious philosophical questions. If you can't really know what a substance is, what a nature is, what a person is, in Greek metaphysical reflection, how do you know what Chalcedon is even saying? That is, that the Lutheran also has a hook in his mouth when he says he doesn't believe, he believes sola scriptura, sola fide. If you push on what the faith is, what the beliefs are, you say, well, actually, those are already metaphysical beliefs. You actually have your metaphysics baked in to your claims. And that if you took the metaphysics out of that, you actually wouldn't have an intelligible faith claim. Does that make sense? So that the person who's saying, I know this all through faith alone, you're saying, I know that you know it through faith alone, but that's not going to hold up on its own apart from Hellenistic philosophical wisdom. So you can't say no to Hellenistic metaphysics and understand what the Trinity is. Right? When we say in the, what do we say at Mass? The consubstantial, right? You say that word, do you ever think, what's consubstantial? Right? That's a Latinization of a Greek metaphysical idea. The early church always was speaking in the unity of metaphysical philosophy with revealed faith. And so to the Lutheran, I would say, if you believe things like the Trinity, which they do, then you actually don't believe your claim that metaphysics is not relevant to your faith. It's a start, anyways. Yes, sir.
You talk about philosophers coming to reason, they coming to God. Where do they think the reason came from?
Sorry, which philosophers?
Well, Aristotle, philosopher.
Oh.
Plato, it's like they use the logic, but by reason you get to God. Where does reasoning come to get to God in the first place?
I mean, just in the simplest terms, they just observe that we are reasonable creatures. The story of the two travelers shows you it's the simple peasant who's using his reason to ask for directions and find his way to his destination. So they simply observe that we are the kind of creatures who think and talk, and we do that in community, and we figure out the truth through that discursive or dialectical process of apprehending the world and making judgments about it, and then arriving at
They attribute the reasoning capability coming from the prime mover.
Oh, I see. Do they attribute it? I think they implicitly attribute it because they say that the mind can't be happy unless it reaches that end, and so it comes from that logos and must return to that logos in order to be happy. And so both Plato and Aristotle absolutely think this, following their teacher Socrates, that the mind's just not going to be made happy until it sees. And this is Socrates' great insight, that in order for the mind to be able to see, it has to be purified, it has to be in a purified body, it has to be asceticist about its life, moral about its life, disciplined about its life, because only a pure moral life will be able to see the intellectual goods. He kind of thinks that what we would call sins kind of cloud our intellect. We see this all the time. Like if you're really committed to some sin, it actually prevents you from seeing. We used to say that in the old days, you used to say that certain kind of sins cause blindness. I won't say which kind, but certain kinds of sins cause blindness. That's really true. That's not literally true, but that's really a Socratic insight, that certain sins cause us to not be able to see higher truths. They kind of pull us down. And so if you're really wedded to a certain sin, you're probably arguing for some error because you've been blinded. But no, they absolutely think that it comes from God, and more importantly, that in order for the mind to be made happy, and thus for the soul to be made happy, it has to see God, or has to see the cause of all things, which they don't usually call God, but we could call God. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the skeptical claim that they're so zealous for their love of truth.
Yeah, this is Augustine's very speculative, yeah.
Which seems very paradoxical, right? Because you can't love what you don't know. So does Augustine ever get into what kind of truth the skeptic knows such that he can love truth in order not to assent to any truth?
Yeah, he sort of, this is he does speak about skepticism in City of God, but his most developed engagement with skepticism is in a very early work from right before he was baptized in Milan, near Milan at a retreat house. And in his dialogue, Contra Academicos, he talks about this in I think the third book. Yes, sir.
When we engage in these ideas, particularly in the context of current theology and current thought, it seems that there's a number of critiques of particularly early 20th century theology in the sense of using Augustine and Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle to reduce God to an idea as opposed to a person. How can we reconcile this whole idea of the first cause and the first mover, this wonderful philosophical development that you're talking about, to someone who says that it is, in fact, if you go this route, you're reducing God to an idea as opposed to dealing with him as a person?
I mean, would they say that that St. Paul was reducing on Mars Hill, on Philosopher's Hill in Acts 17, would they say that St. Paul was reducing God to a rock when he pointed to the stone, to the unknown God, and says, I proclaim to you the unknown God has been revealed in Jesus Christ.
I mean, the critique is of neo-scholasticism, which may or may not be the best reflection of the philosophical tradition. But it seems that the go-to is always, why are you philosophizing someone who we encounter in our religion as God, as a person?
Yes. So there was a pushback to Thomism. Thomism dominated in the late 19th century. It kind of was renewed by Pope Leo XIII and was made the foundation of seminary education from the late 19th century into the 20th century. And this gentleman is talking about a pushback, an anti-Thomism that began to flourish about mid-century, right before the Council, and pushed back against the idea that we actually should have a richly developed natural theology with a kind of preambula fidei arguments which walk towards faith by reason, and they went for a more instead of leading with questions of substance and natures, they led with questions of relation and persons, mainly because of European philosophy had shifted to Heidegger, who thought that substance metaphysics was no longer permissible, that we would know being only through becoming, through process, through evolutionary ways of thinking, and so we should adjust our theology. I think that there's a lot of good in those new theological trends, but that fundamentally it hit the wrong targets. It's absolutely right that we worship a person, not an idea. That's absolutely true, but it's also true that reason doesn't really know how to get to that person. And so we need to engage what reason looks like when it's working well, lift that up, engage with it, and say we're, defend the faith in both the areas of philosophical reasoning, but then do that in such a way that we never neglect to proclaim the gospel. And I think this is the strength of the school, is that it was possible to get out of seminary at a certain time and think that all you needed to know was Aristotle. And that, of course, is wrong too. It would be wrong if all you thought you needed was fundamental theology. From fundamental theology, you should move on to dogmatic theology. After we study De Deo Uno, the one God, the next talk I give will be on the Trinity. Right, now we study the De Deo Trino. And so I think that systematic approach itself can incorporate the criticism that we're not proclaiming the gospel if we pay attention to reason. I think it's got to be like Paul on Mars Hill and say, this unknown God that the philosophers worship, I proclaim to you as Jesus Christ. Do both things. Talk to the philosophers, talk to the skeptics, talk to the materialists about how they reason about the cause of everything. And then don't be afraid to talk about Jesus as a person. Yes, sir?
I was wondering what you could say to us, those of us that have studied a bit of philosophy, and we kind of need a boost coming from people like you that it's okay to have faith and continue to believe, because like a lot of things coming from the secular world, the arguments against belief are sometimes very attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't possibly know what you know about the ins and outs of philosophy. But what can we do in the world to feel more comfortable about
it? For one thing is we're not going to feel more comfortable. We're going to feel less and less comfortable. If you're a serious Catholic who takes your faith seriously, who believes that God is touching you in the Eucharist, things are going to get harder. I don't think there's any way around that. I do not see a way, apart from the God of surprises, doing something miraculous in our culture from things getting easier for Christians generally, for Catholics in particular. So that's the first thing. Things aren't going to get more comfortable. The second thing is Thomas Aquinas has this great throwaway line about how a grandmother, or he says an old lady, I sometimes say grandmother, I think it's warmer than old lady, but as I get older. A grandmother in the pew knows more about God than Aristotle and Plato. You know more about God praying the rosary than Aristotle ever knew. You know more about God than the theologians when you most reverently receive him on your tongue. I think you rest in that and keep reading as you want. But when you rest in that certain knowledge, which has been given to us by faith, you're able to recognize reason working well too. If somebody doesn't sound like they're making sense, use your common sense to say, that doesn't fit with our faith. There must be something wrong with that. I don't know what it is, but I know there must be something wrong with it. If there's 12 genders, that's got to be wrong, right? Genesis says there's 2. That's, I think, how Revelation aids us in being able to just say, gives us what the church calls the sensus fidei. The sense of the faithful is the Holy Spirit working through what's been revealed to us, how we're constantly cooperating with God and the movement of God through the Mass, through the devotions of the church. These things habituate us, and then as we have interest, we can read about materialism or skepticism, or if we have occasions to talk to somebody, a son, a daughter, a nephew, what have you, a co-worker, we can go and read things. But I think there should be, the faithful should have pride is the wrong word, but a holy disposition of confidence. That we've been given something that is greater than what philosophy has been given.
Thank you. Good answer.
Yes?
2 observations. When you were talking about existence, the first thing that came to my mind was when Moses asked God who he was. He said, I am.
Yes.
You know, and that sounded like the crux of it to me. And then your title of your topic, is it rational to believe in God? Is it rational not to believe in God?
Okay, two points. One is this: you're just proving the point from Aquinas that you're a young woman, but anyone of the faithful can know more than the philosophers. That's exactly what all the church fathers and what all the medieval scholastics say about this issue of arriving at God's essence is his existence. They say, oh, that's just like Exodus 3:14. That's just like the revelation of the divine name. And when God says, when he's asked for his name, he says, well, I'm just he who is, right? I'm just existence itself. So you're a stellar theologian already. So 3 credits. Is it rational not to believe? That's a more complicated question. I think one can rationally, one can be rational without having arrived at the demonstration that God exists. Let me put it that way, right? So that I wouldn't want to say someone who has not arrived at a philosophical understanding that God exists, you don't want to say they're dumb or that they're irrational. They have not yet arrived at a rational demonstration which persuades them. And that doesn't mean that they couldn't be brought to that. I think St. Paul here is instructive again, where he says, nobody has an excuse not to know that God exists, right? Everybody is capable of knowing that God exists from the things which have been made, he says in Romans 1. But that doesn't mean that everybody's going to. Right? We're capable. Look at the things which have been made and you can say, well, why are they here? And you should be able to, it's rational to have arrived at it. But if you have not arrived at it, I wouldn't want to say that person is irrational for not having arrived at that. That would be like ad hominem argument, right? You're dumb for not believing in God. But B, it's a conversation stopper. You want to talk to people about what it is they don't believe in. Usually people who don't believe in God don't usually believe in the God that are not believing in the true God. They usually have some fictional image in their head, the spaghetti monster, they have some image of God in their head, an idea of God that they don't believe in. And usually we Catholics want to say, well, we don't believe in that thing that you don't believe in either. But you want to have a conversation that's open and says to somebody, what do you think God is, right? Many times they will not say the cause of everything. They'll say, oh, a human invention, or I think it's, people's, desire for the transcendent experience of their, longings or something like that. They'll say something dumb. But that, you don't want to end the conversation there. You want to say, well, that's not quite what the ancient philosophers thought God was, or that's not quite what Christians think God is. So, you don't believe in something, fine, but that thing that you don't believe in, we don't believe in that either. Yes?
Because you had mentioned before about the distinction between fundamental theology and dogmatic theology. While rationality can allow us to discern the existence perhaps of a God, rationality carries that one step further and bring us to the Christian God, as opposed to like one and kind of stop there.
Oh, this is a great question. The church teaches against rationalism. We can't arrive at the act of faith by reason. So here you're almost with Kierkegaard, right? We actually can arrive, that reason can bring us to arrival of knowledge of God's existence, but knowledge of the Trinity is a gift of faith. We can't look at 3 forms of water or a 3-leaf clover or something and say the world's created by the Trinity. We can't. So what fundamental theology does is shows you how reason is walking towards that, but reason never leads you into faith. It can't lead you into faith. Why? Only God can lead you into faith. And so your faith is actually you cooperating with God's action. Faith is always God's action. Yes, ma'am?
I was wondering if you could talk more about relativism and power. You mentioned that, the my truth versus your truth.
Yeah.
I think that's a very common argument. And I didn't know if you meant, who has power in that equation?
Yeah, in a sense, this is I think at the heart of the discussion of the skeptics. The skeptics, relativism is finally, our modern relativism is what Pope Benedict called the dictatorship of relativism, where the reason why he called it the dictatorship of relativism is because as soon as you don't think truth can be found, then you need to secure your truth. And the only way that you can, if you can't arrive at truth through a process of dialectic, through reasoning, then you're only going to be able to secure your truth by power. And so this is why Pope Benedict calls it the dictatorship of relativism, because you're only going to secure your truth through political power, right? That's skepticism, right? Relativism is our word for skepticism. They would not have used the word relativism in the ancient world. They would have said, oh, you're a skeptic. Oh, you don't actually believe that we can arrive at truth, so whatever it is you want, you're going to achieve that thing as your truth, as the thing that you desire, and you're going to secure it not through argumentation, but through either the rhetorical persuasion, which you don't think is actually logical, but is just, that's what you see on Twitter, or through exercise of overwhelming political force, or market force, or what have you. You're going to use those instruments to achieve your truth because you don't actually think anybody can know truth. And so relativism is at its heart a modern skepticism vis-a-vis an ancient skepticism. And so I think the proper philosophical response to relativism is both to return to ancient realism, arguments about how we can come to know things, apprehend and judge and reason. Use the law of non-contradiction. I can't be Chad and not Chad at the same time in the same way, right? That just that's not possible. So I can know that truth, right? So we need to, I think, recover our confidence in that truths can be known in order to fight a relativism that reduces every truth claim to power. Because as long as we're reducing every truth claim to power, we're going to be in Hobbes's war of all against all. And that's where we are right now. And that's why things are going to get harder for Catholics.
How do you see us fighting that tide? I mean, we have to have some kind of practical element in our education or our home lives to really counter this shift towards, there is no truth.
I mean, we're talking about our Protestant brothers and sisters. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a great Protestant pastor who died during the Second World War, his life was taken by Nazis. But he said in prison that we have to live our lives as though it were the last day, but also as if we had a great future before us. And I think that we have to do that. We have to live our life as if we're going to be martyred tomorrow. But also, to have the fortitude. What kind of formation are you going through in order to have the fortitude to face suffering with fortitude and faith, if you have to face suffering, but also wisdom to know how to avoid suffering, and how to help your neighbors avoid suffering. And I think that last point about helping your neighbors avoid suffering is that we actually need to be well formed enough in our faith, in the practice of our faith, in our devotions, in our reverence for the Lord always has to be increasing so that we can be habituated, so we can be in the habit of bearing witness in public, so that the name of Jesus Christ is always ready on our tongue, so that we can give His forgiveness easily. This is always strikes me about the martyrs, is somehow, by the grace of God, they give forgiveness to the ones that are persecuting them, and they bear public witness, and they themselves become conformed to the sacrifice of Christ in public. And I think we have to think about, the bishops have a Civilize It program right now, that we have to be bearing civil witness, bearing witness to charity and clarity in our public witness. And sometimes that will be through suffering, but hopefully that will mainly be through reasonable witness, through bearing witness to what we believe about reality. And that takes constant formation, constant devotion, to be the kind of people who are credible. Yes, sir?
It is a gift from God. And you say it's going to get worse for Catholics.
I hope it doesn't.
Is that because
I'm trying to keep it from happening, but I don't have that much power.
Does that mean less faith is being given by God? Less people are getting this faith?
Just so somebody say free choice? Yeah.
Less people want to accept it. I think it's, you have to be in a position that you want to receive Him. And when you've got all these other people in your way that see the materialism, there isn't that, and there's just so much influence by them. There are not enough people that can just have that quietness in their faith to say, he's with me and I accept him. I think there's just too much, personally, that's how I feel it. There's too much noise in the world and they're scared that they're going to just be by themselves. And I don't know why there's all this, I've got to be pleasing to all my friends and all this other stuff that's there instead of the real belief.
I have to say, some of you know I'm a convert, but before, convert. But I remember seeing Catholics who impressed me. And remember that seeing a Catholic who impressed me meant seeing somebody in whom the faith ran deep and it had its integrity and strength well beneath the surface. And I think there's a kind of lack of that in modern man. The Catholic should be the most serious and interesting and deep person in the room, and that bears a quiet, silent witness. Maybe it's that you do things that are in service to your neighbor that make that impression. Maybe it's things you say. Maybe it's things you don't say. But somehow the Catholic has this silence, this inner connection to the Lord, and is constantly bringing the Lord's presence wherever you go. And that's, I think, what converts a culture over time. Sometimes you need benefices to cut down trees, but sometimes you need just quiet gestures. Sometimes you need arguments. But it's the serious ones who people are attracted to. Yeah.
I think that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. I agree. I had a conversation with a friend of mine recently where his wife is Chinese, she's not Catholic. She was asking me about my faith. And I said, if I'm not living my life the way that's true to my faith, I'm not going to convince you in a sense. Don't follow me.
I always think about Socrates with this in this way. If Socrates thinks, in order to be a philosopher, I have to live a pure life, how much more should the Catholic think that? Right? How much more should the Catholic think, I need my life purified before I unite myself to the Lord in the sacrament? That's where you get serious, and that's where you become a public witness that attracts, I think. And Bishop Barron's always saying that we need to lead with beauty, we need to lead what is attractive, but the most attractive thing are the saints. The most attractive thing is the witness of sanctity in a life. That's the most attractive thing. People are attracted to a holy life. Yes, ma'am.
Just as an Anglo-Turk I used to study philosophy, but it's so long ago, unfortunately, it's not a keynote line. How can you defend the reasonableness of belief in the face of what I might call scientific or technological fundamentalism, which is incredibly powerful?
Yes. I mean, in a sense, this is what I had mentioned, that the use of science, or as you say, scientific fundamentalism, is actually not really authorized by scientific method, right? If you talk to a real scientist, you say, "What do you do?" Well, I have this experiment that I'm doing, and I've done it 75 times now, and looking for the time in which it, is it going to be? It's going to be falsified, right? But science TM is not the scientific method. Science TM is a philosophical attempt to explain the world as caused by nothing, as caused by chaos, as caused by random chance, as caused by some evolutionary process following some accident. And the way I respond to it is the way Joseph Ratzinger responded to it in his homilies, which are collected under that volume called In the Beginning, in which he says this ends up being a kind of Manichaean view of creation, that the science TM account, the scientific fundamentalism, is really a new theology. It's a Manichaean theology which sees the origins, the creation myths, as creation is this dark matter that's arisen out of some demiurge of violent forces, of conflict. And I mean, it's in a sense, it's insulting to science, because it turns science into a pantheistic religion, and a Manichaean religion at that, which creation is very dark and humanity is very dark, and not surprising that the scientific fundamentalists end up being Malthusians who think that population should be, reduced, that human beings should be reduced, that the worst thing in the world is not even pollution, but the polluters. The worst thing in the world are the human beings, because they're the real source of all the darkness. And so what you get in that scientific fundamentalism is nothing that's scientific. You actually get bad religion. You get a creation myth that is destructive of nature and human nature especially. That's my response. And if you look at any real scientists, the serious scientists will say, we can't know that from science. So none of those things are knowable. Science is humble. Science is experimental. It pursues things very methodically, tests things over and over again. That's what science does. Science doesn't arrive at big philosophical pictures of the whole. Theology does that. Metaphysics does that. Science doesn't do that. So anyone who claims that science does that is actually trying to do metaphysics and theology through science, and that's a category mistake. Yes, ma'am?
How do you feel about the God particle?
That'll be what?
The God particle.
The God particle, doesn't that sound so much like, I don't know if you were listening in the discussion of the pre-Socratics, the late pre-Socratics have this idea that there is a God particle. There is a divine intelligence in the particles of creation. And this is an immanentism in which you collapse the creator-creation distinction, so you collapse the creator into creation, and that's called pantheism. And so they're just like ancient pantheists in which they collapse. So the scientific fundamentalists will tend to do that, yes.
One glimmer of hope, not all scientists are...
Yes, no, I think most real working scientists don't actually believe in science TM.
One of my favorite quotes is actually from Werner Heisenberg, who's quantum physicist and Heisenberg.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, the first sip from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting. And I've always loved that quote because it kind of goes back to that notion of the God particle. Every time we have subdivided the atom into smaller and smaller particles, it gets smaller and smaller still. And I think that's what Heisenberg was right.
I mean, I think it's beautiful, but I worry that it's actually the materialist problem still, and that you're actually still looking for God in the order of causes, rather than making the realist turn to see that God is outside the order of causes and not something that you can find in a particle.